Nathan was a young man in his late 20s, full of energy and curiosity. One sunny afternoon, he decided to take a solitary walk through the woods, seeking some peace and quiet away from the noise of the world. The air was fresh, the trees towering high above him, and the ground beneath his feet was soft, cushioned by the fallen leaves of the season. He was accustomed to walking in the woods, enjoying the natural beauty and the serenity it provided. However, on that particular day, fate had other plans for him. As Nathan ventured deeper into the forest, lost in thought, his foot caught on an unseen root, causing him to stumble and fall hard against the ground. A sharp pain shot through his right leg, and he immediately realized something was wrong. He tried to stand, but his leg wouldn't support him. His foot twisted awkwardly, and as he looked down, he saw that his ankle was grotesquely angled, the bone visibly out of place. The pain was excruciating, a burning sensation that made him wince in agony. Panic set in as he realized the severity of the injury. Alone, miles away from the nearest road, Nathan knew that getting help wouldn't be easy. He tried to calm himself, taking deep breaths and assessing the situation. He knew he had to act quickly if he had any hope of surviving this ordeal. The first thing he did was try to move his leg, but the pain was unbearable. He quickly gave up on that attempt and focused on stopping the bleeding. With no medical supplies at hand, Nathan tore off a sleeve of his shirt and tied it around the broken ankle to control the bleeding. The makeshift bandage helped, but the pain remained, and he could feel the temperature of his body rising as shock began to set in. Nathan had a basic understanding of first aid, but this situation was beyond what he had been trained for. As time passed, his surroundings began to seem more distant. The trees no longer felt like peaceful giants but towering, indifferent obstacles. The sunlight slowly faded, and the woods grew darker. He had no way of knowing whether help was on its way or if anyone even knew he was missing. Despite the pain, Nathan didn't give up. He was determined to survive. He knew that the longer he stayed in one place, the more difficult it would be to get help. So, with great effort, he tried to drag himself to his feet, using the trunk of a nearby tree to support himself. But his leg wouldn't cooperate. Each movement sent waves of pain through his body, and he realized he could not walk, let alone make it back to civilization. His thoughts turned to the survival instincts that would keep him going. He knew he couldn't just wait for a miracle. Nathan had heard stories of people getting lost in the woods and surviving for days on nothing but their wits. He wasn't going to let himself become another statistic. Night fell, and Nathan's situation became even more dire. His hopes of finding help grew slimmer with each passing minute. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones as the temperature dropped. The pain in his leg never ceased, and fatigue began to take over his body. Despite everything, he forced himself to stay awake. He couldn't afford to fall asleep. He had to keep his mind sharp. He needed to stay alert for any sounds of rescue or the possibility of someone passing through. As hours turned into a long and torturous night, Nathan struggled to stay positive. He thought of his family, friends, and the life he had left behind. He thought about what he might have done differently, what he could have prepared for. But regrets wouldn't help him now. He needed to focus on surviving. The next morning, Nathan was still stranded in the forest, his injury worsening. His makeshift bandage had soaked through with blood, and he could feel his strength fading. His thirst was unbearable. and he had no way to quench it. He wondered how long it would take before he couldn't fight the fatigue any longer. But just as hope began to wane, a distant sound reached his ears. At first, it was faint, a mere rustling, but then it grew louder. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. Could it be someone coming to help him? He listened intently, trying to focus on the sound. It was a vehicle, the unmistakable rumble of an engine approaching. With all the strength he had left, Nathan let out a weak shout, hoping someone would hear. His voice, hoarse from thirst and exhaustion, echoed in the woods, and then, as if by some miracle, he heard the voices of people responding. Relief flooded through him as he realized he had not been forgotten. A search team had been out looking for him. Alerted by his family when he hadn't returned from his walk, they had been searching the woods for hours. And they had finally found him. Within moments, they were by his side, assessing his injury and giving him the medical care he desperately needed. Nathan was carefully loaded into an ambulance, and as the vehicle sped away from the woods, he allowed himself to finally close his eyes. He had made it. Against all odds, he had survived the night in the forest. He was bruised, broken, and exhausted, but he was alive, and that was enough. Nathan's experience in the woods taught him a valuable lesson: the importance of preparation, the fragility of life, and the strength of the human spirit. As he recovered from his injury, he found himself more grateful for each day and more aware of the power of resilience. Grizzly, a large and powerful bear, moved through the forest with a sense of purpose. His keen nose sniffed the air, searching for any trace of food, something to fill the hunger that gnawed at him. The woods were alive with the rustle of leaves and the chirp of birds. But today was different. Today, the air smelled unusual, as though something had shifted in the forest. Grizzly wasn't one to question his instincts. They had served him well over the years. He followed the scent, carefully picking his way through the trees. As he moved along, his sharp eyes caught sight of something on the ground, an odd object half buried beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. It was a shoe, a human shoe. His curiosity piqued. Grizzly approached cautiously. His large paws made barely a sound as he neared the object. And he nudged it with his nose. There was something about the shoe that caught his attention. Something different from the usual scent of food or danger. Upon closer inspection, Grizzly noticed something else. The shoe was stained with blood, dark and sticky, and it left a trail as if it had been dragged along the forest floor. This was no ordinary shoe. This belonged to a human. Grizzly's nostrils flared as he inhaled the scent. The strong, salty odor of blood mingling with the faint smell of fear. It was a scent he knew all too well, the unmistakable mark of injury. His instincts told him something was wrong. The blood trail led deeper into the woods, and Grizzly followed, his powerful limbs moving quietly through the underbrush. He wasn't sure what he was following, but he knew that it was important. The scent of blood was fresh, and the presence of a human in the forest at this time of year was unusual. It piqued his curiosity even more. Grizzly wasn't known for his compassion, but his survival instincts had taught him to be aware of danger, and this situation had the smell of danger all over it. As he ventured further, the trail grew more pronounced. There were signs that something had been dragged, and Grizzly's nose led him to a clearing where the scent was strongest. It was then that he saw it, a broken body lying among the leaves. Nathan, the young man, was motionless, his face pale, His leg twisted in a way that Grizzly knew was wrong. His shirt was torn, and the blood, fresh and sticky, soaked into the earth beneath him. The bear paused, his dark eyes scanning the scene with an eerie understanding. Nathan's eyes were closed, and he looked vulnerable, helpless in a way that Grizzly hadn't seen in his years roaming the woods. The bear stood still, uncertain of what to do next. He had encountered humans before, and while most of the time they were harmless, they were also unpredictable. Some would try to fight, others would run, but this one was different. He wasn't moving, he wasn't running, and most importantly, he wasn't making a sound. Grizzly sniffed the air again. His senses heightened. He could still smell the fear. But now, there was something else in the air, a deep, quiet kind of vulnerability. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, acknowledging the presence of something broken and in need of help. Grizzly lowered his nose to the ground, taking in the full extent of the situation. Nathan wasn't just hurt, he was alone. And he needed help. The bear's instincts told him to leave. After all, he wasn't a creature of kindness or mercy. He was a predator, and humans had no place in his world. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in Nathan's stillness. Or perhaps it was the understanding that the young man was part of the same world. A world that demanded survival at any cost. Grizzly had never been one for empathy. But now, in this moment, he felt a strange pull, a feeling that he couldn't quite explain. He took a cautious step forward, his large paws moving silently over the forest floor. His nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, picking up on the mix of scents around him, the blood, the human, the forest. Grizzly wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't a healer, and he didn't know the first thing about helping a human in distress. But his curiosity was still there, as was the faint desire to understand why this young man had ended up alone in the woods. Grizzly hesitated for a moment longer, staring at Nathan. There was no movement, no sign of life. The bear could sense the fragility of the situation, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed as though he was weighing his options. It wasn't in his nature to show mercy, but something about Nathan's quiet suffering stirred something inside of him. He sniffed the air one last time and then turned, slowly backing away from the young man. Grizzly wasn't sure what was driving him. But he knew that he couldn't do anything for Nathan. He couldn't carry him out of the woods or stop the blood loss. He wasn't equipped for human injury. Instead, the bear began to move back through the forest, his mind turning over the strange encounter. He would leave Nathan to the woods and whatever fate awaited him. But something lingered in Grizzly's thoughts. As Grizzly moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world around him began to settle into a familiar rhythm once again. The birds chirped, the wind rustled through the leaves, and the forest resumed its natural course. Yet, in the back of his mind, the image of the young man remained, his face pale and vulnerable, lying motionless among the trees. Grizzly was a creature of the wild, of instinct and survival. He had never known the concept of saving someone or feeling compassion for a creature weaker than himself. But Nathan's quiet suffering had left an imprint, a strange curiosity that lingered long after he had left the clearing behind. It was a moment of rare reflection for Grizzly, one that would stay with him as he continued his life in the woods. In his world, where survival was the only law, perhaps the greatest mystery was not the hunt or the fight, but the strange bond between two creatures who, despite being so different, shared the same world and the same instinct for survival. Grizzly stood still for a moment, staring at the human's shoe in his mouth. His large, powerful paws planted firmly on the ground. His breath deep and steady. As the weight of the situation slowly began to sink in, he had no clear understanding of what it meant to help another creature. He was a bear, driven by instincts, survival, hunger, the pull of the forest. But something about Nathan's stillness, the vulnerability of his broken body lying there in the woods, stirred something in him that he couldn't quite name. The forest around him felt different now. The rustling leaves, the calls of distant animals, everything seemed quieter, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Grizzly had been wandering these woods for years, alone, following the rhythm of nature. He had always been self-reliant, looking out for himself and only himself. But now, with the human's shoe in his mouth, the weight of responsibility felt oddly familiar. Nathan needed help, and Grizzly could feel that deep in his bones. He didn't know what humans could do, how they worked, or what kind of help Nathan might need. He had seen him from afar before, scurrying through the woods, building strange structures, and talking in ways he didn't understand. But Nathan, lying there in pain, helpless, didn't belong in the wild alone. Grizzly had no idea why it mattered. But it did. He felt an urge to do something. To act. With the shoe still clutched between his teeth, Grizzly turned away from Nathan and began to move deeper into the forest. He wasn't sure where he was going, but his instincts told him there were people somewhere nearby, humans, who might know what to do, who might be able to help. His steps were measured, deliberate. His large frame moved through the underbrush with surprising grace, his eyes scanning the woods around him. The further he went, the more determined he became. Grizzly wasn't aware of why he was carrying the shoe, or what he was truly hoping to accomplish by showing it to the humans. He just knew that Nathan was in trouble, and somehow, some way, Grizzly had to make sure that someone knew, that someone would come to help. After what felt like hours of wandering, the familiar scent of human life filled the air. The smell of cooking, the scent of wood, and the occasional laughter of voices reached Grizzly's ears. He followed the smells, his pace quickening. He was getting closer. The closer he got, the more the scent of food and warmth filled his senses. But Grizzly didn't focus on his own hunger. His attention was entirely on the task at hand. He had to find help for Nathan. Eventually, the trees thinned, and Grizzly came upon a small settlement. Several wooden houses were spread out across the landscape, smoke rising from chimneys, and a few people were out in their yards, working. Grizzly stood at the edge of the settlement, still clutching the shoe in his mouth, unsure of what to do next. He had never been this close to humans before. The bear hesitated, his instincts telling him to retreat into the forest. Humans could be dangerous. He knew that. They had their strange ways. And he had learned to keep his distance. But something compelled him to stay. He knew he couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, Grizzly took a tentative step forward. Moving into the settlement, he was careful, his large paws padding softly on the ground as he approached the first human he saw, a man working on a fence. The man glanced up, startled to see the massive bear emerging from the trees. Grizzly stood still for a moment, holding the shoe in his mouth and looking directly at the man. The man's eyes widened in disbelief. But before he could react, Grizzly dropped the shoe at his feet. The man took a step back, his face filled with confusion and fear. But Grizzly didn't move. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the human, waiting for some sign that the man understood. The man looked down at the shoe, then back at the bear, his mind racing to make sense of the strange situation. It took him a moment. But then he noticed the blood on the shoe. His confusion shifted to concern. He bent down cautiously, picking up the shoe and inspecting it closely. Grizzly stood motionless, watching the man's reaction, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where did you find this?" the man asked quietly, his voice filled with both wonder and worry. Grizzly didn't answer. Of course. He couldn't speak. He simply stood, waiting. The man, sensing something urgent, glanced around, then back at the bear. "Is someone hurt?" the man asked, his tone more serious now. He looked at Grizzly, his brow furrowing. The bear didn't know how to answer. He didn't know what humans needed in a situation like this. But he could feel the urgency in the air. Without another word, the man dropped the shoe and motioned for Grizzly to follow him. The bear hesitated for a moment. But then, almost instinctively, he stepped forward, following the man as he moved toward a group of others nearby. Grizzly didn't understand what they would do. But he knew he had to bring him to Nathan. He had to make sure they understood the urgency. That Nathan needed help. The group of humans quickly gathered, murmuring in confusion as they saw the bear approach. Some of them backed away in fear. But the man who had first found the shoe spoke up, explaining the situation. "There's a person hurt out in the woods. This bear found his shoe. There's blood on it. We need to move quickly." The urgency in the man's voice sparked action. A few of the humans immediately grabbed their gear, medical supplies, ropes, and blankets, and set off in the direction Grizzly had come from. Grizzly, now knowing that help was on the way, watched them go, a sense of relief washing over him. He didn't fully understand what had just happened, or why he had acted the way he had. But in that moment, as the humans moved toward Nathan, Grizzly felt a strange satisfaction. He had done something that had made a difference. For the first time in his life, Grizzly felt like he had been part of something larger than himself. He had no words for it, but the feeling of having helped, even in his own way, was enough. As the humans disappeared into the woods, Grizzly turned and made his way back into the forest, feeling the weight of the shoe finally lift from his mouth. The forest was still, but somehow it seemed quieter now, as though everything had shifted. If only just a little. Grizzly had done something unusual, something unexpected, and in the silence of the woods, he felt a small sense of peace. He didn't understand everything about humans, or why his actions had mattered. But deep down, Grizzly knew that he had brought help to Nathan, and that, in itself, was a victory. Grizzly walked slowly, his massive paws brushing the forest floor as he carried Nathan's shoe carefully in his mouth. The woods around him were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. But inside his chest, a deep sense of urgency pounded with each step. His instinct told him he was heading in the right direction. But as he approached the edge of the forest, he felt an unfamiliar sense of hesitation. The bear had never ventured this close to the village before. He had always kept his distance from humans. But today was different. Today, something inside him urged him to keep moving forward. The village was small, nestled at the base of the hills, its houses scattered among the trees. Grizzly approached cautiously, peeking out from the woods and into the open space where the homes stood. People were going about their business, moving from house to house, tending to chores and calling to one another. Grizzly wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this was where he had to go. He needed help. Nathan was counting on him. As Grizzly moved closer, the first person to notice him was an elderly woman standing near the well. She froze, her eyes wide with fear as the bear emerged from the tree line. The woman took a step back, but Grizzly didn't stop. He continued walking, his eyes locked on the shoe in his mouth, knowing that the scent of blood and injury would make his message clear. The woman's fearful cry echoed through the village. A bear is coming," she yelled, pointing toward Grizzly, her voice filled with panic. At once, chaos erupted. Children ran inside their homes, and people quickly retreated behind doors or gathered at a safe distance. Grizzly stood still, waiting. He wasn't here to harm anyone. He was here for something far more urgent. It was then that Anna, a young woman in her 30s, stepped out from the crowd. Her face was calm, her brow furrowed in thought as she observed the bear. Unlike the others, she didn't retreat. Instead, she walked closer to Grizzly, her eyes flicking down to the shoe the bear held in his mouth. That's Nathan's shoe," she murmured softly to herself. She took another step forward, her heart racing, but she knew what she had to do. Anna had grown up in this village, and she had known Nathan since he was a boy. Her mind raced as she pieced together what the bear might be trying to tell them. A human in the woods, alone, injured, it was the only explanation that made sense. The crowd behind her began to murmur, but Anna held up her hand to silence them. She knelt down in front of Grizzly, carefully studying the bloodstains on the shoe, the torn fabric, and the unmistakable signs of distress. She didn't hesitate for a moment. She understood the urgency of the situation. "We need to find him," Anna said firmly, standing up and turning to the others. "Nathan's in trouble. We need to go after him. Now." The villagers, still uncertain about what was happening, looked to Anna for direction. Some of them began to step forward, realizing the severity of the situation. Anna was well respected in the village, known for her sharp mind and quick thinking. She had a way of remaining calm even in the most chaotic situations, and the villagers trusted her judgment. She turned back to Grizzly, who was still standing silently before her, his eyes fixed on her. His massive form was imposing, but there was something almost pleading in the way he watched her. Anna knew that Grizzly wasn't just a bear. He had acted with purpose. He had brought them this shoe. He was trying to help. Anna didn't question the bear's actions. Instead, she walked closer to him, her hand reaching out gently to touch his fur. It was a gesture of reassurance, something to show the bear that she understood. The others in the village were still hesitant, but Anna didn't wait for their approval. "I'm going with him," she said decisively. "Grizzly knows where Nathan is. We need to follow him." A few of the villagers began to prepare, gathering whatever supplies they could find: blankets, medical kits, and anything else that might be needed to tend to Nathan's injuries. But Anna didn't wait for everyone to be ready. She was already heading back toward the woods, Grizzly trailing behind her. The forest felt different now. The air was thick with anticipation. The shadows of the trees deep and quiet. Anna kept her eyes on the path ahead, trusting Grizzly to lead her. The bear moved with purpose, his head low as he followed the scent trail he had picked up earlier. Anna kept pace beside him. Her thoughts focused on Nathan, praying that they would find him in time. As they moved deeper into the woods, the silence grew heavier. Anna could hear the crunch of leaves beneath Grizzly's paws, the occasional snap of a branch. Every now and then, she would glance at the bear, whose powerful frame seemed to glide effortlessly through the forest. He was leading her, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward this unexpected guide. Despite the danger of being so close to the bear, she felt a strange bond with him. They were both here for the same reason, to find Nathan and bring him back. The forest was dense, and Anna's heart raced as they moved through the underbrush, pushing forward in search of Nathan. She had no idea how much further they had to go, but she trusted Grizzly's instincts. He had found her the shoe. He knew where Nathan was. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at the clearing. Grizzly stopped, his massive body stiffening as he surveyed the area. Anna followed his gaze and immediately spotted Nathan. He was lying on the ground, motionless, his face pale and his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Anna's heart sank, but she didn't hesitate. She ran to Nathan's side, her hands shaking as she knelt beside him. She quickly assessed his condition. He was badly injured, his leg broken, and there was blood on his shirt. But he was alive. That was the most important thing. "Nathan," Anna called softly, her voice trembling. "Nathan, can you hear me?" Nathan didn't respond, but his shallow breathing told Anna that he was still conscious. She glanced up at Grizzly, who stood silently nearby, watching over them. The bear hadn't left, hadn't wandered off. He had stayed by her side, guiding her here, making sure that Nathan wasn't left alone. Anna moved quickly, tying a makeshift tourniquet around Nathan's leg and checking for signs of other injuries. She spoke to him softly, trying to reassure him, even though she was frightened herself. "We're going to get you out of here," she whispered, her hands working quickly. "Help is on the way. You're not alone." With Grizzly standing guard, Anna continued to care for Nathan as best as she could, knowing that the village wasn't far behind. Grizzly had led her here, and now, she would do everything in her power to save Nathan. And in the quiet of the forest, Anna couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward the bear who had brought him together. Anna sat beside Nathan, her hands gently tending to his injuries as Grizzly stood quietly nearby, his eyes scanning the forest. The bear's massive form seemed almost out of place in the peaceful clearing. Yet there was something profoundly comforting in his presence. The pain Nathan had endured still showed on his face, but Anna could see that he was slowly regaining strength. His breaths no longer as shallow, his pulse stronger under her touch. It had been a long journey to this moment. Grizzly had led Anna through the dense woods, through the confusion and the fear, all the way to Nathan's side. Now, with the young man resting on a makeshift stretcher crafted from branches and blankets, the village's rescue party was already on its way. It wouldn't be long before they reached the safety of home. But in that still moment, it felt like the world had paused, holding its breath as if to acknowledge the quiet miracle that had just unfolded. Anna glanced up at Grizzly. The bear was still, his large frame blocking the sunlight as he stood sentinel over them. There was no growl, no aggressive posture, only a calm, steady presence, as though he too understood that their work wasn't done. He had brought Anna here. He had saved Nathan. even though he hadn't understood the full gravity of his actions. The bear had done what no one else could have. Driven not by any promise of reward, but by a quiet sense of purpose that transcended the divide between man and beast. As the minutes ticked by, Anna spoke softly to Nathan, telling him that help was on the way. She told him about the village, about the people who had rallied together to find him. She reassured him that he would be all right. But even as she spoke, her thoughts often returned to Grizzly. The bear had acted out of instinct. But in that instinct, there was an unmistakable wisdom, a wisdom that Anna couldn't ignore. Grizzly had understood something essential, that in a world where humans and animals often stood apart, there was still a bond, a thread of connection that ran deeper than words. It wasn't long before the sounds of the village's search party reached the clearing. Several villagers, armed with medical supplies and wrapped in blankets, arrived, their eyes wide with wonder and disbelief at the sight of the bear. But Anna wasn't surprised. She had seen it for herself, the bond that could exist between creatures of all kinds. If only people were willing to recognize it. The villagers approached slowly, cautiously, but Anna held up her hand to stop them. She had already seen how Grizzly had acted, calm, patient, protective. He hadn't posed any threat to her or Nathan. There was no need for fear. She spoke to the bear in a soft voice, thanking him for his help. The bear turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with those deep, knowing eyes, but said nothing. He didn't need to. As the villagers set to work, carefully lifting Nathan and stabilizing his leg, Anna took one last look at Grizzly. The bear's role was done. He had led her here, saved Nathan from a fate much worse than injury. And now, he would return to the woods. His actions would not be forgotten, but they needed no recognition. He wasn't seeking thanks. He had acted out of something that transcended gratitude, a silent, unspoken understanding that sometimes, even in the wildest places, help could come from the most unexpected sources. With Nathan safely on the stretcher, Anna turned to Grizzly, her voice filled with quiet admiration. "Thank you," she said. The words felt insufficient, but they were all she could offer. Grizzly nodded once, a subtle movement that seemed to acknowledge her gratitude. And then, with a final glance toward the village and the people gathered around, the bear turned and lumbered back into the woods. His massive form disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only the faintest sound of leaves crunching beneath his paws. Anna stood silently for a moment, watching him go. She had always known that nature had its own way of communicating, its own wisdom that didn't always make sense at first. But now, in this quiet moment, she understood something deeper: the forest, the animals, the world beyond their human borders. These were not just places to be feared or conquered. They were places where connection existed, even across vast differences. As she walked back to the village with Nathan in tow, she couldn't help but reflect on how nature had a way of teaching the greatest lessons when least expected. Grizzly had shown him not just the power of survival but the quiet force of compassion. A force that even an animal as wild and untamed as a bear could embody. The story of Nathan's rescue wasn't just about a young man in peril. It was about something much larger, the unspoken bond that connected all living things. In the days that followed, Nathan recovered, his leg mending slowly but surely, and the village continued its everyday rhythm. But the story of Grizzly's unexpected act of kindness spread through the village, becoming a legend of sorts. The villagers talked of the bear who had helped save a man's life. And though some still marveled at the strangeness of it all, others began to see the forest not as a place of danger, but as a place of profound beauty and mystery. Anna would never forget that day, and neither would the others. It was a reminder that kindness could come in many forms, sometimes from the most unexpected places. The animals of the world, too, had their own wisdom, their own way of showing care for one another, and it was a reminder to all who heard the story that perhaps, in the quiet of nature, there were deeper truths to be uncovered, truths about survival, compassion, and the unspoken ties that bound them all together. And so, the story of Grizzly, the bear who had saved a life, became a lasting reminder of the power of nature's wisdom, of the kindness that could exist even in the wildest hearts, and of the enduring connection between humans and the creatures of the earth. It was a story of survival, yes, but also of kindness, and the beauty that could be found when both nature and humanity recognized each other's need for care and compassion.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.